currently is part of North Arlington and then all the way down the Potomac from Chain Bridge all the way down to National Airport. That's its current boundaries. In the next iteration, it may include Newport News. I'm not entirely certain. I wanted to talk to you very briefly about an extremely in the weeds but extremely important aspect of redistricting. It's one that Tony Troy referred to and some of the other speakers have referred to also, and that's population deviation standards. One of the key principles of fair redistricting is the preservation of communities of interest. Keeping communities together is one of the reasons that the U.S. Supreme Court permits flexibility in population deviation for state legislative districts, as opposed to the congressional standard, which is basically zero tolerance. State legislative districts only have to show a substantial equality of population. It's become generally accepted that population difference between the largest and smallest state legislative districts, the total deviation, may be as much as 10% of the average state legislative district population. But even that 10% figure can be breached for good reason. Virginia's own legislative redistricting in the 1970s went up into the double digits. And it's significant. The reason was it preserved municipal jurisdiction boundaries. It kept them intact. In contrast to this flexible standard of higher deviation in population among districts, 10 years ago, as was noted, Virginia went down to an overall 2% deviation. This was a political policy decision. It wasn't made because there was any need or any requirement for 2%. The practical result of imposing this narrow tolerance is that the map drawers are forced to divide cities and counties among legislative districts. Under the 2% deviation standard that the House and Senate chose to impose for state legislative districts 10 years ago, 57 of Virginia's 135 cities and counties were split among multiple House districts, and 41 of the 135 were split among more than one Senate district. Now, part of this, of course, was due to the size of the city or county. Obviously, Fairfax County's population demands multiple Senate and House districts, but part of it was forced by the 2% standard. Now, if every state legislative district is required to have arbitrary minimum population standards, then cities and counties are going to have to be divided. If communities of interest, as reflected in jurisdictional boundaries, is to be preserved as a criteria, it's counterproductive to limit that goal through rigid deviation standards. As a legislator, I'd like to give a practical perspective on this question. Now, some people think that the role of a legislator is crafting high policy, and to an extent that is true. But for the most part, we're a service business, kind of a legislative jiffy lube. As an important part of our role, we need to meet the needs of both our individual constituents and the communities in which they live. This latter job is especially important in a Dillon rule state in which every city and county must go to Richmond to address every aspect of their operation. Avoiding the needless splitting of cities and counties among legislative districts will help us to do our job better. For these reasons, I hope that the Commission would support a flexible deviation standard that goes up to no more than plus or minus 5%. So thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I think you're doing a wonderful job going around the state, getting the views of citizens on this most important question.
I do have a couple of questions.
Sure.
We heard from a student group last week from William & Mary that basically made a very similar argument to yours. Mm-hmm. They essentially said that they could keep far more jurisdictions together and regional boundaries together if they use this 5% standard rather than the 2% standard. Mm-hmm. And you have a sense that that's absolutely the case as well.
I believe that's the case, and I believe it would serve a very important public purpose.
One of the things that sometimes does nothing. But is it necessarily the case that you're actually better off if it's all Arlington County, or if Alexandria perhaps can have 3 people instead of 2 that are actually advocating on their behalf?
I understand the argument that if you, well, for instance, Arlington County right now is represented by 4 delegates and 2 state senators. State senators basically split the 4 delegates. 2 of them, Patrick Hope and myself, represent only Arlington, and 2 of them have very small pieces of Arlington. I understand the argument that it's easier to spread out the workload and to build coalitions and so on if you have a larger number of members. But I think that that's outweighed strongly by the argument that if you have a unified jurisdiction with a fewer number of members that they can go to and who represent them, I think overall you have a better policy outcome.
What's your sense of what's easier for voters to understand?
Well, it's difficult enough, especially in Northern Virginia. I can't tell you the number of people who think that they live in Roslyn, Virginia, or Crystal City, Virginia, which don't exist legally, as opposed to Arlington, Virginia. I think that if you had the same grouping of legislators as you do for local officials and so on, that you'd have a better understanding of where it is you live, what the local